He thought forcing her onto that stage would earn him laughter, but he had no idea he was about to witness the moment that would quietly dismantle everything he believed about talent and status. The grand recital hall of Whitmore Conservatory shimmered under warm golden lights, chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, the air filled with the low murmur of elite guests, donors, and faculty dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns, their voices carrying the confidence of people who believe they understood excellence. And at the center of it all stood a black Steinway piano, pristine, intimidating, a symbol of mastery that only the finest were allowed to touch. And just beyond the spotlight, unnoticed by nearly everyone, stood Emily Carter, her simple navy dress unremarkable, her posture reserved, her presence blending into the background like she had trained herself to be invisible, moving quietly between music stands and sheet folders, assisting where needed, never interrupting, never drawing attention, because in a place like this, attention was reserved for those who had earned prestige, not for someone like her. At least that's what they believed. And from the far side of the stage, Professor Richard Halston watched the room with a practiced smile, his silver hair perfectly styled, his tailored suit a reflection of decades of authority, his reputation as one of the most respected piano instructors in the country firmly established. And tonight was his moment. The annual Conservatory showcase where the most gifted students would perform before an audience that could shape careers, every note judged, every movement analyzed, every mistake remembered. And as he scanned the stage, something caught his attention, a disruption, subtle but inconvenient. His star pupil, the one scheduled to perform the evening's most demanding piece, had just stepped back, pale, uncertain, whispering words Halston did not want to hear. Something about not being ready, about the pressure, about the difficulty of the composition. And for a brief moment, irritation flickered across Halston's face, because failure was not something he tolerated. Especially not tonight, not in front of this audience. And as silence threatened to creep into the room, his mind moved quickly, calculating, searching for a solution that would preserve his image. And then his eyes landed on Emily, standing quietly near the edge of the stage, holding a stack of sheet music, her presence so ordinary it almost felt convenient. And in that instant, an idea formed, one that to him seemed harmless, even amusing, a way to fill the gap, to entertain the audience, to maintain control. And with a slight tilt of his head and a voice that carried just enough authority to command attention, he called out, "Miss Carter, isn't it?" And the room shifted ever so slightly as a few heads turned. Curiosity sparked not by recognition, but by confusion, because no one expected a name like hers to be spoken in a room like this. And Emily paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the papers, her eyes lifting toward the stage lights, calm but alert. "Yes, Professor," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the sudden weight of attention pressing against her. And Halston stepped forward, his smile thin, controlled. "We seem to have an unexpected opportunity," he said, his tone light, but edged with something sharper beneath. "Why don't you take a seat at the piano and help us continue the evening?" And a ripple of quiet amusement passed through the audience, subtle, contained, but unmistakable, because to them, this was a moment of curiosity, perhaps even entertainment. The idea that someone like her, someone clearly not part of the elite circle, would step onto that stage. And for a second, time seemed to slow, the lights warmer, the air heavier, as Emily stood there, the distance between her and the piano suddenly feeling much longer than the few steps it actually was. And somewhere in the room, a faint whisper slipped through, "This should be interesting," followed by a soft chuckle quickly stifled. And Halston, confident in his decision, gestured toward the instrument, as if inviting her into a space he believed she could never truly belong to, unaware that in choosing her, in placing her under those lights, he had just set something irreversible into motion, something the room was not prepared to witness, something that would not need words to prove its power, because sometimes the quietest presence carries the loudest truth. And as Emily Carter finally took her first step toward the stage, the polished floor echoing softly beneath her shoes, no one, not the audience, not the students, not even Professor Halston, realized that the moment they were about to witness would not be a performance of failure, but the beginning of a silence so complete, it would change how they saw everything. The soft echo of her footsteps carried farther than it should have, each step across the polished stage sounding almost too loud against the quiet that had begun to settle over the room. And Emily Carter could feel every pair of eyes following her now, not with respect, but with curiosity edged in quiet doubt, the kind reserved for someone who clearly did not belong in a place like this. And yet she did not rush, did not hesitate either. Her pace steady, controlled, as if the weight of their judgment was something she had long since learned how to carry without letting it show. And behind her, Professor Richard Halston folded his hands loosely in front of him, watching with a faint, almost amused patience, the kind of expression that suggested he already knew how this would end. Because in his world, outcomes were predictable, talent came with credentials, and mastery had a very specific look. And Emily Carter did not fit any part of that image, not in her simple dress, not in the way she avoided eye contact, not in the quiet way she existed at the edges of the conservatory. And as she reached the piano bench, the massive Steinway seemed even larger up close, its glossy black surface reflecting the stage lights like a mirror, its presence commanding, almost intimidating. And for a brief moment, she stood there without sitting, her hand hovering just above the polished edge, as if acknowledging something unseen, something only she understood. And in the audience, a few subtle reactions rippled outward, a raised eyebrow, a slight tilt of the head, someone shifting in their seat, the quiet language of people waiting for something awkward to unfold. And somewhere near the front row, a young student leaned toward her friend and whispered under her breath, "Is this real?" And the response came with a barely contained smile. "It will be over in a minute." And that assumption lingered in the air, unspoken but shared, because to them, this was not a performance. It was a pause, a brief interruption before the real program resumed. And yet, as Emily slowly lowered herself onto the bench, something about her composure did not quite match their expectations. There was no visible panic, no rushed movement, no nervous adjustment, only a stillness that felt deliberate. And Halston noticed it too, just for a fraction of a second, a subtle shift in his expression, though it disappeared almost as quickly as it came, replaced again by quiet confidence. And he stepped slightly to the side, giving her full view of the instrument, his voice carrying just enough to reach the front rows as he said, "Take your time," though the tone suggested the opposite. And Emily nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before placing the sheet music on the stand, the pages already familiar to her eyes, though no one in that room knew that. And as she adjusted the position of the bench by a fraction of an inch, the faint scrape against the floor seemed to echo louder than expected, drawing even more attention to the moment. And then came the pause, longer than anyone anticipated, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the keys without touching them. And the silence stretched, not uncomfortable yet, but noticeable. And in that space, the room began to shift again, impatience replacing curiosity, someone clearing their throat, another checking their watch, the low hum of expectation tightening. And Halston's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to betray a flicker of irritation, because this was not supposed to linger. This was supposed to be brief, controlled, predictable. And yet something about the stillness felt different, as if the moment itself was refusing to move forward until it was ready. And Emily inhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, her shoulders rising just a fraction before settling again. And when her hands finally lifted from her lap, hovering above the keys, the motion was smooth, unhurried, and strangely precise, like someone who was not guessing, not hesitating, but remembering. And in the audience, the whispers faded, replaced by a quieter attention, not respect yet, but something closer to focus, as if instinctively, people were beginning to lean in without realizing why. And Halston, still standing to the side, felt it too, though he would not have admitted it, that subtle shift in the room, that almost imperceptible change in energy. And for the first time that evening, he found himself watching not with amusement, but with a hint of curiosity, because something about the way she sat at that piano did not match the narrative he had already written for her. And as her fingers hovered just above the first note, perfectly aligned, perfectly still, the room seemed to hold its breath without being told, suspended in that fragile moment before sound, before judgment, before everything. changed. The first note did not announce itself loudly. It arrived with a quiet certainty, clean and deliberate. A single tone that carried farther than anyone expected, cutting through the air with a clarity that made several heads lift almost instantly. And before the audience could even process what they had just heard, the second note followed, then the third, each one placed with such precise control that it began to dismantle the assumption lingering in the room. Because this was not hesitation. This was intention, and Emily Carter did not rush. She did not attempt to impress with speed or force. Instead, she allowed the piece to unfold exactly as it was meant to, her fingers moving with an ease that did not match the story they had written for her. And within seconds, the melody began to take shape, not as a struggle, not as an attempt, but as something deeply familiar, something owned. And the subtle shifts in the audience became impossible to ignore. A man in the second row leaned forward, his arms slowly uncrossing. A woman near the aisle stopped fidgeting with her program, her attention now fixed entirely on the stage, and the quiet whispers that had once carried doubt began to dissolve into silence, because there was nothing left to whisper about. And from the corner of the stage, Professor Richard Halston's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening just slightly, his expression losing a fraction of its confidence, though he remained still, watching closely now, no longer out of amusement, but out of something closer to calculation, because the phrasing was correct, not just technically correct, but emotionally precise, the dynamics rising and falling with a level of control that suggested not just training, but mastery. And Emily's hands moved across the keys with fluid precision, her wrists relaxed, her timing exact, each transition seamless, as if the instrument itself responded to her rather than the other way around. And the piece, known among the Conservatory as one of the most difficult selections in the program, one that even advanced students approached with caution, was being played without visible strain, without the tension that usually betrayed effort. And that absence of struggle became the most unsettling detail of all, because mastery without effort was something the room recognized instantly, even if they were not ready to admit it. And a student seated near the front slowly lowered his phone, forgetting to record, his attention pulled fully into the performance, while another, who had earlier laughed, now sat completely still, her expression shifting from amusement to disbelief. And as the tempo subtly increased, Emily followed it effortlessly, her fingers accelerating without losing precision, each note landing exactly where it belonged. No hesitation, no correction, no sign of uncertainty. And the sound filled the hall now, rich and full, resonating against the high ceilings and polished surfaces, transforming the space itself. And the audience, once relaxed and conversational, now sat in complete silence, the kind that does not need to be requested, because it forms naturally when something demands to be heard. And Halston's gaze sharpened, his mind racing through possibilities, trying to reconcile what he was witnessing with what he believed to be true, because this was no longer a simple mistake, no longer a moment of curiosity. This was something else entirely, something that did not fit. And as Emily transitioned into a more complex passage, one that typically exposed even the smallest weakness in technique, her execution remained flawless, her expression unchanged, calm, focused, almost distant, as if she were not performing for the room at all, but simply continuing something that had already begun long before she stepped onto that stage. And for the first time that evening, the power dynamic in the room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, like a tide turning beneath the surface. And though no one spoke, no one moved, the realization began to settle in quietly, spreading from one person to the next, that the woman they had dismissed, the one they had invited as a distraction, was not struggling, was not trying. She was revealing, and the more she played, the clearer it became that this moment was no longer under their control. And as the final notes of the current phrase rang out with perfect resonance, hanging in the air just long enough to be felt before fading into silence, the room did not react. Not yet, because they were still catching up to what had just begun to unfold. And in that suspended silence, something irreversible had already taken hold. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the hall like something alive, something growing heavier with every passing second, as Emily Carter continued to play, her fingers no longer simply moving across the keys but commanding them, shaping each phrase with a level of authority that no one had granted her, yet no one could deny. And the piece, once seen as an impossible challenge, now unfolded with an elegance that felt almost effortless, each transition seamless, each dynamic shift deliberate, as if she were not following the composition but redefining it in real time. And the audience, once composed of critics, donors, and experts who prided themselves on recognizing excellence, now sat completely still, their expectations quietly dismantled note by note, because what they were witnessing was not just technical accuracy, it was interpretation, depth, something far beyond what they had anticipated from the woman they had barely noticed moments before. And in the front rows, a distinguished guest who had spent decades attending performances at the highest level slowly leaned forward, his expression no longer neutral but intent, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to understand how he had misjudged so completely, while a young pianist seated beside him gripped the edge of her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by something closer to awe, because she understood, perhaps more than most, exactly how difficult this passage was, and exactly how impossible it should have been to play it this way. And yet Emily did not falter, not even once, her timing exact, her control unwavering, and there was no visible strain, no tightening of the shoulders, no hesitation in the hands, only calm precision, the kind that comes not from practice alone, but from something deeper, something earned over years that no one in this room had taken the time to imagine. And at the edge of the stage, Professor Richard Halston's composure began to crack, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but in small, telling details, the slight shift of his stance, the way his fingers pressed together a little tighter, the faint narrowing of his eyes as he watched, no longer calculating how to move past this moment, but struggling to understand it, because every second that passed contradicted everything he believed about hierarchy, about who deserved to be here, about who had the right to command that instrument. And as Emily moved into the most demanding section of the piece, the one that typically exposed even the most skilled performers, the energy in the room shifted again, this time unmistakably, because anticipation replaced doubt, the audience no longer waiting for her to fail, but holding their breath to see if she could maintain what she had already proven, and the complexity of the music intensified. Rapid sequences flowing into intricate patterns that required absolute control, and still, she did not lose it, her fingers gliding across the keys with astonishing clarity, every note distinct, every phrase complete, and the sound filled the hall with a richness that seemed to settle into the very walls, resonating long after each passage ended. And somewhere in the back, a man who had earlier dismissed the moment as a novelty now sat frozen, his arms at his sides, his expression blank with disbelief, while another quietly shook his head, not in rejection, but in silent acknowledgement that what he was hearing could not be explained away. And as the final movement approached, the tempo building, the intensity rising, Emily remained unchanged, her expression steady, her focus absolute, as if the entire room had faded away and only the music remained. And then, with a final sequence executed so cleanly it felt almost unreal, she brought the piece to its conclusion, the last note ringing out with perfect resonance before dissolving into silence. And this time, the silence was different, not uncertain, not questioning, but complete, overwhelming, as if the room itself needed a moment to recover, and no one moved, no one spoke, because in that instant, the truth had settled in fully, undeniable and irreversible. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter sat quietly at the piano, her hands resting gently in her lap once more, her posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, while around her, an entire room struggled to process the reality that they had not just witnessed a performance, they had witnessed the collapse of every assumption they had made just minutes before. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed, as if the entire conservatory had been suspended in a fragile stillness that no one dared to break, the final note still echoing faintly in their minds long after it had faded from the air. And then, almost imperceptibly, a shift began, not loud, not immediate, but undeniable, a single pair of hands rising somewhere in the middle rows, hesitant at first, as if unsure whether applause was even appropriate after something so unexpectedly profound. And then another, and another, until the sound began to build, not into the polite, measured clapping that typically followed performances in this room, but into something fuller, something unrestrained, a wave of recognition that could no longer be held back, and within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause, the sound echoing against the high ceilings, filling every corner of the space with a force that felt almost overwhelming. And yet at the center of it all, Emily Carter did not react immediately. She did not stand, did not bow, did not seek acknowledgement. She simply remained seated for a brief moment longer, her gaze lowered, her hands resting calmly in her lap, as if she were allowing the room to catch up to something she had already known all along. And when she finally rose from the bench, her movement was quiet, composed, without urgency, as though the applause was not something she needed, but something she accepted with quiet grace. And across the stage, Professor Richard Halston stood frozen, the sound of the applause surrounding him but not reaching him in the same way, because for him, this was not celebration, it was realization, a slow, uncomfortable awareness settling in, piece by piece, that the moment he had orchestrated as a demonstration of control had instead become a revelation of his own misjudgment, and his eyes remained fixed on Emily, searching for something that would restore his sense of certainty, some sign of hesitation, of luck, of coincidence, anything that could explain away what had just happened. But there was nothing, only her steady composure, her quiet presence unchanged, and that absence of explanation was what unsettled him most, because it meant the truth was simpler than he wanted to admit. He had been wrong, completely and undeniably wrong. And as the applause continued, a few members of the faculty exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced with something closer to discomfort, because they too had participated in the moment, had allowed it, had assumed the outcome without question, and now they found themselves standing in the aftermath of something they could not undo. And near the front row, the same young student who had whispered earlier now watched Emily with wide eyes, her expression no longer amused, no longer doubtful, but deeply respectful, as if she had just witnessed a standard she had not even known existed. And the realization spread quietly through the audience, not through words, but through subtle shifts in posture, in expression, in the way people looked at the woman who had just stepped away from the piano, because she was no longer invisible, not anymore. And yet, despite the overwhelming reaction, Emily did not linger. She did not step forward to claim the moment, did not address the audience, did not explain herself. Instead, she turned slightly, offering a small, respectful nod toward the instrument, almost as if acknowledging it rather than the crowd. And then she stepped away from the stage with the same quiet composure she had entered with, her footsteps once again soft against the polished floor, though this time, every step seemed to carry a different weight, not the weight of being overlooked, but the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. And behind her, the applause continued, louder now, sustained, as if the room itself was trying to hold on to the moment just a little longer. And Professor Halston remained where he stood, his expression no longer controlled, no longer certain, but unsettled in a way that could not be hidden, because the narrative he had relied on, the structure he had trusted, had been dismantled in front of everyone, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something far more undeniable. And as the sound of applause slowly began to fade, leaving behind a lingering echo in the vast hall, one truth settled quietly over the room, clear and inescapable, that talent does not announce itself through appearance, and mastery does not ask for permission to be seen. It simply reveals itself, and when it does, no amount of assumption can stand in its way. The applause eventually softened, fading into scattered claps and quiet murmurs, but the energy it left behind did not disappear. It lingered in the air, in the way people remained seated just a little longer than usual, in the way conversations did not immediately resume, as if no one quite knew how to return to normal after what they had just witnessed. And near the edge of the stage, a few faculty members began to gather, their voices low, controlled, but edged with something unfamiliar, uncertainty, because moments like this did not fit neatly into the structure they were used to maintaining. And Professor Richard Halston stood among them, silent at first, his gaze still fixed on the empty piano bench, as if expecting something to reverse, something to correct what had just unfolded, but nothing did. The instrument remained still, the stage unchanged, and the reality of the moment settled deeper with each passing second. And finally, one of the senior instructors leaned slightly toward him, his voice careful, almost cautious. "Richard, who is she?" And it was a simple question, but it carried weight, because it implied something none of them had considered before, that they should have known, that they should have recognized. And Halston did not answer immediately, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the tension beneath his otherwise composed exterior, because the truth was not something he could present with authority. It was something he had overlooked, dismissed, and now, in front of his peers, he had no explanation that could restore his position. And across the hall, small groups began to form, quiet discussions unfolding as guests turned to one another, their earlier certainty replaced by curiosity, by questions that demanded answers. Was she a guest performer? Has she studied here before? How have we never heard of her? And each question echoed the same underlying realization, that something extraordinary had been hidden in plain sight, unnoticed not because it was invisible, but because no one had thought to look. And near the aisle, the young student who had once whispered doubt now spoke with quiet intensity to her friend, her voice no longer amused but earnest. "Did you see her hands? That was not just technique. That was something else." And her friend nodded slowly, unable to find words that felt adequate, because what they had witnessed had not only challenged their expectations, it had expanded them. And further back, a distinguished donor adjusted his glasses, still processing, his mind replaying the performance, analyzing each detail as if trying to understand how something so refined could come from someone who carried herself with such simplicity. And yet, no matter how he examined it, the conclusion remained the same. Excellence does not require announcement. It reveals itself when given the smallest opportunity. And at the far end of the stage, a junior staff member approached Halston cautiously, holding a program in her hand, her voice respectful but firm. "Professor, should we update the schedule?" And the question, though logistical, carried an implication he could not ignore, because the evening had shifted, the expectations had shifted, and the control he once held over the narrative of this event had slipped in a way he could not immediately reclaim. And for the first time in years, he found himself without a prepared response, his authority momentarily suspended in the face of something he had not anticipated. And as the room slowly began to transition back into movement, people standing, adjusting their coats, exchanging glances that carried more meaning than words. One thing remained unchanged, the absence left by Emily Carter's quiet departure, because she had not stayed to receive questions, had not remained to be acknowledged. She had simply stepped away, leaving behind only the undeniable impact of what she had done, and that absence became its own kind of presence, shaping the conversations, guiding the thoughts of everyone in the room. And as the final echoes of applause disappeared into the high ceilings, a subtle but lasting shift settled over the conservatory, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply felt, because in a place built on prestige, on recognition, on carefully defined standards of excellence, one quiet moment had revealed something far more powerful, that true mastery does not need validation to exist, and those who underestimate it often do so at the cost of their own certainty. By the time the room began to settle into a new rhythm, the absence of Emily Carter had grown more noticeable than her presence had ever been, and that absence pulled at the attention of those who had only just begun to realize what they had missed, because now that the performance was over, now that the applause had faded, the questions had nowhere to go except toward the quiet space she had left behind. And near the side corridor leading away from the stage, a small group of students moved quickly, their earlier composure replaced by urgency, as if they feared the moment might disappear entirely if they did not catch it in time. And among them was the same young woman who had once whispered doubt, her expression now focused, determined, because something about what she had seen had shifted her understanding in a way she could not ignore. And as they reached the hallway, the contrast was immediate, the grandeur of the recital hall replaced by softer lighting, muted walls, and the distant hum of routine activity, a space where extraordinary moments were not expected to happen. And yet, at the far end of the corridor, they saw her, walking at the same steady pace, carrying a small stack of sheet music, her posture unchanged, her presence once again blending into the environment as if nothing significant had just occurred. And for a brief moment, none of them spoke, unsure how to approach someone who had so completely redefined their expectations without ever asking for recognition. And finally, the young student stepped forward, her voice hesitant but sincere. "Excuse me, Ms. Carter?" And Emily paused, turning slightly, her expression calm, attentive, as if she had simply been called back to a routine task rather than stopped after something remarkable. "Yes," she replied softly, and the student hesitated, searching for words that felt sufficient, but finding none that fully captured what she had experienced. "That performance, it was incredible," she said finally, her voice carrying both admiration and disbelief, and Emily offered a small, polite smile, not dismissive, but not indulgent either, as if the compliment, while appreciated, was not something she needed to hold on to. "Thank you," she answered simply, and the brevity of her response seemed to catch them off guard, because they expected more, an explanation, a story, something that would help them understand how someone who appeared so ordinary could possess such extraordinary ability. And another student stepped forward, curiosity overcoming hesitation. "Where did you train?" he asked, his tone respectful now, the earlier assumptions completely gone. And for a moment, Emily considered the question, her gaze steady, thoughtful, before answering in the same quiet tone. "In many places, over time." And the answer, while honest, offered no clear definition, no credentials to anchor their understanding, only the suggestion of a path that could not be easily summarized. And the group exchanged glances, unsure whether to press further, because there was something in her demeanor that discouraged intrusion, not through resistance, but through a quiet sense of boundary. And behind them, footsteps approached, more measured, more deliberate, and when they turned, they saw Professor Richard Halston standing at the entrance of the corridor, his presence commanding attention even now, though the certainty that once defined it had softened, replaced by something more restrained, more careful. And for a moment, no one spoke, the air holding a different kind of tension, not confrontational, but significant, because this was no longer a dynamic of authority and compliance. It was something else entirely, something unspoken yet understood. And Halston's gaze met Emily's, and in that brief exchange, the weight of the evening settled fully between them, not as conflict, but as recognition, because whatever assumptions had existed before had already been undone, and there was no path back to them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been on stage, controlled, but without the edge it once carried. "Ms. Carter," he said, and the formality of the address was not lost on anyone present. That was an exceptional performance, and the pause before his words made them feel deliberate, chosen, and for a moment, the hallway fell silent again, not with anticipation this time, but with acknowledgement, because something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And Emily inclined her head slightly, a simple gesture of respect, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, as if the moment required no further elaboration. And in that quiet exchange, the final layer of the evening's transformation settled into place, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through the undeniable presence of truth revealed. And as the hallway returned to its gentle rhythm, one realization lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, that sometimes the most powerful statement is not made through words, but through the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to prove anything at all. The hallway did not return to normal immediately, because something in the air had changed in a way that could not be undone. And even as the small group stood there, unsure whether to speak or simply absorb the moment, Professor Richard Halston took a slow step forward, not with the commanding authority he had displayed on stage, but with a measured restraint that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully. And for a man who had built his reputation on certainty, on precision, this hesitation was not unnoticed, and the students standing nearby instinctively shifted slightly, creating space, not out of fear, but out of recognition that what was about to be said carried weight beyond the usual exchange. And Halston's gaze remained steady on Emily Carter, no longer searching for flaws, no longer attempting to categorize her within the boundaries he understood. but instead acknowledging something he could not easily define. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quieter depth. "I would like to know," he began, pausing just briefly as if the words themselves required adjustment, "why someone with your level of ability has chosen to remain unseen." And the question lingered in the space between them, not accusatory, not dismissive, but genuine, and it revealed more than he likely intended, because it exposed the framework through which he viewed the world, one where talent naturally rose to visibility, where recognition was the inevitable outcome of excellence. And Emily listened without interruption, her expression calm, thoughtful, as if she had encountered this question in different forms before, and for a moment, she did not answer, allowing the silence to settle just enough to shift the weight of the conversation. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained soft, steady, but carried a clarity that drew everyone's attention. "Not everyone measures value the same way," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried a quiet authority that made them land with unexpected force, and Halston's expression tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition that the answer did not align with his expectations, because it did not offer justification, did not seek validation. It simply stated a perspective he had not considered, and the students nearby exchanged glances again, sensing that this moment was no longer about performance, but about understanding something deeper, something that extended beyond technique or skill. And Halston took another step forward, his posture no longer rigid, but attentive. "You could have a place here," he said, his tone more measured now. "A formal position, recognition, opportunities that match your ability." And the offer, though presented professionally, carried an underlying urgency, as if restoring balance required integrating what had disrupted it. And for a brief moment, the hallway seemed to pause again, the weight of possibility hanging in the air, because in this environment, such an offer was not insignificant. It represented status, access, validation, everything the institution was built upon. And yet Emily did not react immediately. She did not show surprise, nor excitement, nor hesitation, only a quiet consideration. And then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, her expression unchanged. "I already have what I need," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer created a different kind of silence, one that was not filled with anticipation, but with realization, because in that moment, it became clear that what she valued could not be offered by titles or positions. And Halston held her gaze for a second longer, as if searching for something more, something he could still engage with. But there was nothing to challenge, nothing to correct, only a calm certainty that stood outside the structures he understood. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because there was nothing else he could do, and the students standing nearby felt it too. That quiet shift, that subtle dismantling of assumptions that extended beyond the stage and into something more personal, more lasting. And as Emily adjusted the papers in her hands and turned to continue down the hallway, her steps once again soft and unhurried. The group did not follow this time. They simply watched, understanding now that not every story demands explanation, not every mastery seeks recognition. And as she disappeared around the corner, leaving behind nothing but the memory of what had unfolded, one truth settled quietly among those who remained, that sometimes the most extraordinary presence is the one that never needed to be seen. And once revealed, it changes not only how others are perceived, but how we measure value itself. The hallway slowly emptied, footsteps fading into distant echoes, conversations dissolving into quieter tones, until only a few remained standing in that space where something intangible had just taken place. And even as the evening resumed its formal structure inside the grand hall, the shift that had occurred refused to be contained within the walls of that performance, because it had already begun to settle deeper in the minds of those who had witnessed it, in the quiet reconsideration of what they thought they understood about talent, about status, about who deserved to stand in the spotlight and who did not. And back inside the conservatory, the program eventually continued, the next performer stepping onto the stage, the music resuming as expected, yet something felt different, not wrong, but altered, as if the standard itself had quietly moved, and the audience, though attentive, no longer listened in the same way, because now they had something to compare it to, something that had not been introduced with prestige or reputation, but had revealed itself with undeniable clarity. And in the front row, Professor Richard Halston remained seated, his posture composed but his expression distant, his attention no longer fixed entirely on the performance before him, but divided, pulled back again and again to the memory of what he had witnessed, replaying each moment not as a critic evaluating technique, but as a man confronting the limits of his own assumptions. And the realization did not come all at once. It unfolded gradually, layer by layer, as he recognized how easily he had dismissed someone based solely on appearance, how quickly he had assigned value without seeking understanding, and how confidently he had acted on those assumptions in front of an entire room. And now, sitting in the same space where he had once held unquestioned authority, he felt something unfamiliar, not humiliation, not defeat, but clarity, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles quietly, reshaping perspective in a way that cannot be undone. And across the hall, the students who had followed Emily into the corridor returned to their seats, but they did not return as they had been, their expressions more thoughtful, their posture more attentive, because they had not only witnessed skill, they had witnessed something more meaningful, the quiet strength of someone who did not need recognition to validate her worth. And that understanding carried weight, influencing how they listened, how they observed, how they would approach their own paths moving forward. And as the evening drew closer to its conclusion, the final performance ended with polite applause, the kind that fit the structure of the event, measured, appropriate, but lacking the raw authenticity that had filled the room earlier. And when the lights softened and guests began to stand, gathering their belongings, preparing to leave, the conversations that followed were not centered on the scheduled performers, but on the unexpected moment that had redefined the entire evening. And names were exchanged, questions repeated, theories offered, but no explanation fully satisfied what they had experienced. Because some truths do not need explanation, they simply exist. And outside, the cool night air greeted the departing guests, the city lights reflecting off polished glass and quiet streets stretching beyond the conservatory, and somewhere beyond that building, beyond the conversations and the lingering questions, Emily Carter continued her evening as she always had, unchanged, unannounced, carrying with her the same quiet composure that had defined her presence all along. And inside the minds of those who had witnessed her performance, something remained, not just the memory of extraordinary skill, but a deeper awareness, a recognition that value is not always visible, that mastery does not always introduce itself with titles or recognition, and that sometimes the most powerful truths arrive quietly, revealing themselves only to those willing to see beyond what is expected. And as the final lights dimmed within the conservatory, leaving the stage empty once more, one realization settled fully into place, clear and lasting, that respect is not granted by position or appearance. It is earned through presence, through substance, and once it is revealed, it cannot be taken away. And on that night, in that hall, the world did not simply witness a performance. It remembered what true dignity looks like.